Well, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar for Knowledge Miles, the 695th Lord Mayor's Lectures. In this free online series, we address connections in and around London Square Mile, the world's coffee house, if you like, and how these connections may help us tackle future global challenges. The title of today's webinar is Intellectual Curiosity, how the growth of institutions like the Athenaeum Club have contributed to the life and success of London. My name's Philip May and I'm a member of the Athenaeum Club, where I'm helping organise events to celebrate our bicentenary this year. I'm delighted that we have Sir Kenneth as our speaker today. Sir Kenneth is Chairman of Business London, previously known as London First, and has extensive experience of technology and financial services. His public service activities include serving on the boards of social inclusion and social mobility charities. Sir Kenneth was appointed Lord Lieutenant of Greater London in 2015 and knighted in 2018. He is also a past master of the Worshipful Company of Information Technologists. Well, that's the formal bit, but Ken, before you get going, the thing I noticed about your CV is that it's listed, you are searcher of the sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. Now you're going to have to tell us about that.
You're sitting next to one of the luckiest people in the world. And a couple of years ago, 4 years ago, I think now, I was appointed as High Bailiff and Searcher of the Sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. So I have two titles, not that I want to brag, but it is two. And there's a High Steward as well. The High Steward is the Duke of Buccleuch. In the old days, when Westminster, the city, was run by the Abbey, the High Steward was essentially the chap that ran everything. I suppose he came to the mayor, and I, several hundred years ago, would have been chief of police and managing discipline and collecting debts and so on. And of course, the Abbey, people sought sanctuary there to escape from evil, etc., etc. But you could only get sanctuary if you were legitimately do it, as opposed to being a criminal trying to escape arrest. So somebody had to go around and check that the people seeking sanctuary were safe, he alliterated.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for that clarification. We've got 45 minutes for our session today, and we'll allow plenty of time for questions. Please, if you are watching online, ask your question through the question box on screen. Those will come straight through to me, and we'll get those answered once Ken we've done a little bit of opening Q&A. The webinar will be recorded, and the recording should be available in a couple of days. Now, before I ask Ken to speak to the moderated questions, I'm going to say something briefly about the Athenaeum, of which we're both members, because it's very much in the title, and I think it's very relevant to the topic. So the Athenaeum is a private members club. It was founded in 1824, and I think it's a great example of an independent London institution. And I think what made it unique for its time was that members were elected for their attainment and achievement, not by accidents of birth. And in the words of the founder of the Athenaeum, John Wilson Croker, it was a club for literary and scientific men and followers of the fine arts. By contrast, most of the London clubs at that time were aristocratic in nature, and entry was reserved for the upper classes. The Athenaeum was quite different. Michael Faraday, a name will be very familiar to many of you, who was an original member and indeed the first club secretary, was the son of a blacksmith. That's a big contrast to most of the aristocratic clubs. And no fewer than 113 of the Athenian early members, that's those really in the first half century of the club, no fewer than 113 of those members included engineering in their professional descriptions. And you won't be surprised to hear that includes the likes of Humphrey Davy, who was an original member, I.K. Brunel, Robert Stevenson, William Fox Talbot, Thomas Telford, and James Watt. And indeed, that tradition of engineers and scientists continues to the present day. Additionally, unlike many other clubs of the day, the Athenaeum was not party political. This differentiated from clubs like the Carlton, obviously a conservative club as it is today, or the Reform Club, which was Whig or Liberal. Croker himself, interestingly, was a Tory, but ensured that Whigs and Liberals were actually in the majority on the committee. And I think in the characteristics of the early Athenaeum, we see a link to the success and development of London. The club was formed in 1824 at a time of growing pressure for local and national government to address dire living conditions for much of the urban population, and the public health of the nation at large. And it's remarkable how many of the key people who addressed those problems were Athenians, members of the Athenaeum Club, whether as scientific, engineering or medical experts, or as civil servants and politicians. They showed in their ingenuity in their chosen subjects how to get improvements in public health, public provision of, for example, sewage, transportation. And it's the multidisciplinary nature of these approaches and the way they work together, I think, which is particularly noteworthy here. The club was a preeminent place in which many of these influential people could meet and discuss things. Faraday, for example, discovered the link between electricity and magnetism. That's a key piece of scientific knowledge. Without Faraday's discovery, without electricity, much of the modern world would not be possible. You don't need me to enumerate what those things are. Sir Joseph Bazalgette, who created the sewage system for London, actually designed the system to cope with a population of 8 million at a time when the actual population of London was 4 million, a degree of prescience that we should celebrate. I think there's a phrase, what did the Victorians do for us? And I think actually they did quite a lot for us. It may well be now that the time has come to update, but clearly that was forward looking. And as I said, the development of the railway system, not only the overground, but the underground system, was pivotal. Without development of that system, it's hard to see how Londoners could have travelled to work, or indeed how Londoners could have been supplied with food, which is obviously vital. And you may think, well, surely these people could have created these inventions without being members of the same club. Maybe, but I think part of our thesis here is the nature of these institutions and the working together between people from different professional backgrounds has actually added, so there's been a multiplier factor, if you like. And so we see organisations like this as a place for debate, discussion, intellectual stimulation, and also study and education. I think when you look at many of these early organisations, they had extensive libraries. That's very true of the Athenaeum, which has got some 80,000 books. And indeed, many of today's members value the club as a place for quiet reading in an increasingly frenetic world. The club has been described as a club of the mind. That tradition has continued into the 20th century, and 52 Nobel Prizes have been awarded to club members, and that's continued right up to the present day. I think the latest recipient of the Nobel Prize who was a club member was David Trimble, Lord Trimble. And since 2002, both men and women have been admitted as members of the club. And in our bicentenary year, the Athenaeum preserves the link of continuity of the vision of our founders, an emphasis on intellectual achievement in many different walks of life, and openness to members from the widest spectrum of backgrounds. I cannot emphasize that enough. And a public service ethos, which I think is extremely important. I believe certainly that today's members stand on the shoulders of great people, and we should strive to match their example. I'm now going to really start the moderated Q&A with Ken. And Ken, you're a member of several London institutions. Which ones are they, and what's led you to join the Athenaeum in particular? And perhaps you continue to be members of others as well, so I'd be interested to hear about those too.
Yes, I haven't dropped any. So I belong to a few clubs in St James's, 2 or 3. The Royal Overseas League, because of my role as Lord Lieutenant, means there's the R is important in the Royal Overseas League, and so we have a connection there. I've been a lifelong, actually since university, member of the Oxford and Cambridge Club. I just saw we had a question in about whether women were admitted at the Athenaeum, and you've answered that in the positive, and we've had a nice response from the lady who asked the question. But I'm rather proud of the fact that I was one of a gang of 4 who fought for women to be admitted as equal members at the Oxford and Cambridge Club. I'm also rather proud it was a long time ago in the 1990s, so I was an active member of the club as opposed to merely someone who popped into the bar. And I have some city connections, a long line of them, one of which is I'm a failed aldermanic candidate. That's a sulking point, but I just like to get it off my chest. I'm also...
Explain to our audience what an alderman is, because I think I know, but I'm not absolutely sure.
One of those flashes of ambition, I kept secret from my wife. I thought I'd quite like to be the first black Lord Mayor of the City of London. And to do that, you have to first of all be an alderman. And to do that, you therefore have to stand for election. So I stood for election and lost.
Commiserations.
I'm unused to this. And the most embarrassing moment was after losing. There was both I and the victor had to give a speech. I had no idea I was going to have to give a speech. It was Vincent Keaveney, a wonderful man. I must admit, I don't mind losing to him. He went on to become Lord Mayor. Damn. But he gave a most graceful, I have to say, speech. And then I had to give a defeat speech, and I haven't really got one of those in my locker. So anyway, you haven't come on to listen to this to hear about my sores and my wounds, but that was an interesting experience. I am past master of a livery company, the information technologist, and I played, I think, a full role there. And I've recently become an honorary liveryman of the Leather Sellers, which is very much devoted to charity. So I think I've got feet in both sides of the square mile, the inside and the outside, as it were. And I think I could be described as clubbable.
Yeah, and the liveries are very interesting. So I'm myself a member of a livery, and they seem to, in a way, divided to two groups. And you, I think, sort of alluded to that there. So the information technology is obviously very much today, where people are very focused on something which is a growing industry. And the leather sellers, yes, there's a historic background there, but there's actually a huge charitable side. You know, what do you see from your knowledge of livery companies about how they develop and contribute to the success of London?
And I think what's really interesting about it, the great test of a livery company explanation is to speak to someone who's not British about them, because it is the most bizarre thing. They've heard of guilds usually in other countries, but the guild it's evolved the guild concept into something very 21st century. So all livery companies are bound by one big thing, which is we have 4 objectives. We worry about the trade, so leather sellers do still worry about leather selling and leather production. Information technologists, obviously, we can't believe our luck, how popular we've become, but very much involved with what's happening, so AI and so on, things that matter a lot to us. But we also care about education broadly, and so my livery company started a school in conjunction with another livery company, with the Mercers, some years back, and in Hammersmith there is a big secondary school that we raise the money for to create and manage. So education and the trade, but we also care about, there is a collegiality dimension to it. So we do meet, we talk, we exchange ideas, we look for things to do, and most importantly though is the 4th leg, which is that of charity. And I think the livery companies give something like £50 million a year away, and as Lord Lieutenant, I see a lot of that coming into the boroughs of London. And it's such an interesting idea. Someone who thinks they are a fill in the blank, but in my case an information technologist, an engineer or something, suddenly find themselves part of a fraternity, a sorority, a group of people who are driven by those 4 things. And I think that's kind of a strand, a red line that runs through clubs and these kinds of institutions.
Yeah, and that's very interesting. So we've had an interesting question come in about if the club didn't exist today, would it be necessary to invent it? I think we can broaden that out to why do we need, surely you could do individual philanthropy on the charitable side, or surely, as I think I alluded to in my opening remarks, that these engineers and scientists would have done their own thing. Do you think there is something about the way people get together and debate and discuss things and collaborate, which is a kind of multiplier factor? I mean, that would be my thought, but I'd be interested to hear your views on this.
I'm a businessman in my day job, as it were, and a phrase I hear so much is the problem with this fill in the blank is it's all silos. And one of the big weaknesses of the human condition is, in my experience, is we end up being a something in a silo. And once you're in a silo, you're missing out the fact that the world is this big and you're just in a slice. And for me, the epiphany was a long time ago, but the epiphany was in the chemistry lesson in the 6th form at school.
Right.
And I loved chemistry. I did a lab at home. I sort of breathed chemistry. And I didn't like physics, therefore, because they were seen to be oppositions. It's a long time ago. Silo 1, silo 2. And one day we were in a chemistry lesson, and it was on electrolysis, obviously physics. So I got really grumpy about the fact I was doing physics in a chemistry lesson, and I put my hand up and complained to the teacher. And she looked at me. I remember it's one of those great learning moments. She just looked at me with a kind of patronizing but sympathetic view. And she said, Kenneth, it's all the same. and it wasn't 2 silos called chemistry and physics. It's actually knowledge, human condition. And at university, I discovered something called general systems theory, written by a man with the wonderful name of Ludwig von Bertalanffy. And his hypothesis is there is a set of equations which will describe absolutely everything, from economics to environment, etc., etc. We just haven't discovered them all yet. But in his thesis, would take a set of equations which were used for, it doesn't really matter, but for geography, and apply them to economics and make his point. Because, to quote Miss whatever her name was, it's all the same. And so if you don't get together with people who don't come from your silo, as it were, you think it's all about silo and the rest. So I think the human need to be able to explore what I'm calling the system is fundamental. And I like to think those founders of the Athenaeum, that's what they did. If I'm sorting out sewage, sewage alone, it's a big, very important topic to do with health. And it's not a silo thing about pumping fluid.
And of course, there's also another dimension to this, a public policy dimension, which is you can have a lot of technical ideas, but you have to sell them into politicians. You have to make them happen in practice. So there's a persuasion job there, and I think again that is about getting together with people and making the case.
So I think that's a very powerful point, because we see this a lot with business leaders, politicians, and so on. They've got their blinkers on about whatever their topic is, and they don't see anything beyond the blinker, which is not quite the same as a silo. And so they get angry because people aren't then liking what they're saying. And the reason they're not liking is people can see the broader picture, the horizon. And it's made more complicated, I have to say, choosing my words carefully, in the 21st century with what's called the woke revolution, where people are so sensitive about what they say may or may not offend somebody, that they're reluctant even to raise a topic. So we end up with a shriveling of debate and discussion, as opposed to a de-siloization, a word I've just made up.
Yes, and obviously in the age where people increasingly, because of the pandemic, working from home or working remotely, and there are signs that will continue to some degree, there must be a worry. Well, is this something which over time, are these institutions where people get together, are they like offices in a way going to be semi-permanently kind of shrunken as a proportion of the world, or do we actually think that somehow there's just a sort of human need to spend time together?
I think actually the West, at any rate, is facing an existential threat here.
Right.
We've all got so used to doing things on Teams and Zoom and so on, that we're losing the ability to exchange the bits that matter as humans. And I have a story. I'm chairman of a company, and it's an IT company. We've got a potential buyer of the business. We're some years away from it, but I touch wood up. Hopefully we're traveling the right direction. An American company, and they sent their second in command to London to meet us. My chief executive spends most of his time in meetings on Zoom or Teams. And I've told him he's got to get out. He's got to get out and meet people, etc., etc. And we had this lunch in a restaurant in the city. Chap turns up from America. There are three of us. But in one of those banquettes that everybody who's in the city will recognise, there's a table around there. So three of us sitting there, chap turns up, we have to get up. So we have to do this kind of round to get round, to say hello, then we sit down again, and somebody to give the loo, so we have to do the same thing. And there's all this sort of animal body language and communication, which has got nothing to do with our EBITDA and projections for the next 3 or 4 years. We have a very good lunch together. It's all very convivial. I was the first to leave, and I called up my chief exec in the evening and said, how did it end up? But it seemed to be okay when I left it. Was it all right when you left it? He said, yeah, we had a good time. He said, and then after we finished lunch, we went off and played some pool. And I said, I think I've just won my argument.
So I think the other interesting thing about these organisations is that we've talked about a variety of organisations from liveries, which are often focused on one trade, to the Athenaeum, which is more broad. I mean, we've had a questioner make the point that the Athenaeum is an organisation which includes the spiritual dimension, bishops, for example. So I think there's a kind of civil society element here as well, which we need to take into account, perhaps. And perhaps we come back to that.
But Philip, I think you're right. I think it's so important. So we seem to have got into a world, a time in our history, where people just shout things at each other, and they're not listened to, or they're listened to by an echo chamber. But there's no proper dialogue. There's no dialectic. It is all just statement. Now, I think if you are an Arsenal fan arguing with a Chelsea fan, that's probably okay in the pub on the third pint. That's probably okay. But if you're talking about how to save the world from climate change, for example, that's far from okay. I had the privilege earlier this week of meeting a former soldier who's now a businessman and potentially a client, was the context. But I got him to tell me his backstory. And he told me the story of how the British Army helped the United Nations with the Ebola outbreak in Africa. And he was a big part of that. And his role was attitude changing.
Yeah.
And the problem was that people thought it was evil spirits and not a bug and so on. And so they were just behaving stupidly given what we knew about the science. And his job was to understand that and then promote messages which nudged people into behaving properly. So again, I'm going to like a ranter here, but again, if we don't care about those things, people just die. And so it's not just let's get the bug sorted out. It's a whole social.
It's part of it's about trust, actually. Getting people's trust, and
yes.
Ultimately you get that trust by engaging with them, probably face to face, by sitting down over a meal with them, just sort of breaking bread, sharing time with them. I think these things are quite important. Maybe that is the background to some of these institutions.
I went to a book launch not very long, a few months ago now, the book was called The Social Brain. And the presenters were two leadership experts from the Saïd Business School in Europe. University, and an anthropologist stroke zoologist. So three people, and the anthropologist stroke zoologist talked about things he had learned about how chimpanzees organize themselves, and he compared it with how military bodies, regiments and so on, organize themselves. And then the two leadership experts talked about how if you're in charge of something, how you need to learn those things and understand them. And that so profound point was in our lifetime, at least in our lifetime, we've begun to realize that we should worry about physical well-being at work. The second point was we've recently and are still learning that we've got to worry about mental well-being at work. And their argument was we've also now got to worry about social well-being at work. And I gave an interview, I started a meeting in the worst time of lockdown. And there was 4 or 5 people like me with book-lined walls behind us, etc., etc., etc. There was one young man who obviously relatively recently graduated in his bedroom. And so you could see his bed behind there. He's having a conversation. He's doing his best to join in with the old folks on the rest of the call. But I looked at him, I thought, poor bloke. So he's going to spend 8 hours in bed. He's going to spend 8 hours in his bedroom working. And I look back at my time when I was an undergraduate. I probably spent 16 hours in bed, in the bedroom. But no sociability at all. Yeah. So we're losing something. And the benefit of a club is you can find yourself sitting next to the bishop or the sewage expert or something, and you can strike up a conversation. And you're not going to argue God is more important than sewage or sewage is more important than trade. You're going to explore areas,
different perspectives. Can I maybe slightly switch tack now and just ask a little bit about, maybe bring it to sort of the UK-wide thing. Obviously 1824, heyday of the Industrial Revolution. Britain was preeminent in science and technology, the railway, we talked about this already. Fast forward to 2024, we're very good at AI. We have a lot of ideas. You're a technologist. Do you think Britain is still at the top table, and if we maybe are in danger of being off the top table, or perhaps we are off the top table, what would we do to earn our place in the world? I'd put it like that.
Yes, I think we are at the top table. I think intellectually we're definitely at the top table. I think from a values perspective, we haven't really talked about. I think we're also at the top table. I'm lucky enough to chair a couple of non-British companies, an American one and an African one. And our nation is held in high regard by the people I have to deal with. So I think, yes, I think what matters for the future, which is essentially intellectualism and values, yes, we are at the top table. Where we begin to slide down the league, though, is then in the implementation and exploitation for general well-being of those things. And in my day job, one of my rants is I have written, although yet to get a publisher for it, a book called The Babbage Curse, focused on Charles Babbage, who of course invented the computer. His sidekick, Ada Lovelace, rather. She invented programming.
Yes.
So this fantastic, the whole industry exists on those two things. All that happened was he died almost impecunious, and she went off to do rather more exciting things than computer programming. There are a lot more exciting things than computer programming. She was a bit extreme though. But I cite the Babbage curse as we seem to be really good at getting those first bits going. We crack the intellectual problem, we get the prototype, and then it somehow fizzles out. And as this is a city institution that we work today, it didn't used to fizzle out because the coffee shops in the city had people who said, so you've got a boat and he's got a something, and if I bring this together with my money, we can all profit from it, and you can achieve your ambition. Those connections are not as strong and certainly not as effective now. And if there's anything that we need to crack as a nation, it's that.
So it's part about the financing of great ideas, sustainable financing of great ideas, and bringing them to fruition through the sort of the product development.
Yes, I say this carefully to you as a banker. So yes, it's not just the money though. The old merchant banking model was you had somebody who certainly provided money, but they stayed with the business to help it grow. It wasn't just an estate agent. I've taken the property and I've done something. And I think that's broken down in the city. Probably Big Bang did it, but that's broken down. And I think the renovation of that has to be a national priority. And again, it's going to require people in business, people in finance, etc., all to talk to each other about how it's in their mutual interest to make that happen.
No, that's very interesting. One sort of further question that we talked about, I think is to do with the rule of law. And could we, are civil society institutions somehow part of, we talk about the importance of rule of law, that's absolutely vital, but is that partly based on the regard in which civil society institutions have for each other, and the way in which they foster positive relationships between people, which is somehow supportive of the rule of law? So you're not just reliant on an external set of rules and regulations. I'm thinking perhaps particularly the city here, but it's got broader application. My word is my bond. Just give us your thoughts on that for a couple of minutes, if you would.
So I think what you're looking at there is, I'm going to rephrase the question. If I got it wrong, then correct me.
I don't think there's any right or wrong here. Okay. I think we're trying to get sort of got your thoughts.
So I think I play the dinner party game. I encourage everybody to play this dinner party game at the stage when everyone's talking to everybody else around the dinner table. Say, choose a nation. You start with our own, any nation, and say you have to define their values with one word. And if I had to do that, and for my various different hats, I would say community would be the word that I would choose. There are other nations I wouldn't name because that'd be rude, but there are other nations where, for example, opportunism would be the word that one would choose. We saw in the COVID pandemic here, how people just came together. Suddenly people worried about the old lady around the corner who was doing her shopping, etc. And that community bond came bubbling out in a way. Nobody looted shops or houses or something because they could, because they're unguarded. They helped other people do. So community is extremely powerful. Now, why does this nation care about community more than some other nations? I would say the platform of the rule of law is something we just take for granted. And again, another hat that I wear, I'm involved with recruiting magistrates in London. I was at a swearing-in ceremony.
Your role as Lord Lieutenant.
Actually, in my role as Custos Rotulorum in that particular case, but yes, we'll do. And I went to a swearing-in ceremony, and there were 15 people who have stayed the 2-year course it regrettably takes to become a magistrate. And talking to them, why do you want to become a magistrate? Well, because I think I'll give something back. Why do you want to become a magistrate? Because I think it's really important that people like us are part of the judicial system. And these are people who are doing it for no money, and actually quite a lot of grief because the administration is quite heavy, but doing it for no money because they think, and I agree with them, that having real people administering justice along with professionals is the way that we make sure it belongs to the people and it doesn't become the rule of law driven down by some
It's not a top down.
Exactly.
It's a bottom-up thing as much as anything else.
I think
people's values.
Yes, I think Putin would argue that he also believes in the rule of law, but he uses it to control the people. In our case, it's the people who are implementing the law, and so there's something fundamental about the I guess the culture of the nation, which is there. So we've got almost all of the ingredients we need to have another industrial revolution.
Well, that's very interesting. That's actually very positive, and I certainly think when I was thinking about this session, I wondered why there'd been so much growth in these type of organisations. And maybe if you were French or German or American, you could sit here and say the same about your nation. But it did strike me that some of the things that have been part of Britain's history have helped in that. So religious and political freedoms, we all quote Magna Carta, I think that was important. The Elizabethan religious settlement, if you like, the settlement after the English Civil War, which allowed people to really pursue their own beliefs and values, provided they do it within the context of the framework of law. And then I think this sort of huge growth of industry and commerce in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, which gave us the money, which is actually vital as well. It's another part of the whole jigsaw puzzle, if you like. So it's its values, its beliefs, and it's having the wherewithal to actually put those into practice. I think that's very important. I think maybe that's been a great, we've only got 15 minutes left. I think it's been fantastic. Thank you for that. We've got our red telephone boxes on the screens to indicate communications, perhaps of a slightly old-fashioned type, but nevertheless sincere form of communications, which those of us of this age are very familiar with. I'm going to look now at some of the questions that have come up. So a question that's here is, how do we ensure that in breaking down one set of silos, we don't create another set of silos based on race or class? Very topical, obviously. What's your perspective on that, Ken?
Well, leadership is a big part of the answer to that question, I think. And then the question is, and where does the leadership come from? And before we start to moan about politicians and so on, which seems to be at the moment where we're all waiting for the shoe to drop, so that's the answer. I think the leadership comes up from the people, not down from the people who have the leadership role at the particular time. And so in a nation that cares about community, that genuinely cares about community, if you agree with my one word to describe us, which is obviously a little bit silly, but if you, it's not silly, but it's a little bit too de minimis. But if you take that for a working hypothesis for a moment, you said that broadly the people in this country care more about the people of this country and each other than they do about being selfish for themselves. And I know I'm generalizing, but it's the generalized point that matters. Then race and class don't get a look at. If, on the other hand, it's about opportunism, then race and class and money do get a look at. So I think it's incumbent on those of us who can speak out and be listened to make sure that we amplify and emphasize why that community spirit is in everybody's interest, community, as opposed to just in the interest of the small number. Then I don't worry about it. And I mean, it will surprise listeners perhaps, but we were talking earlier on about kinds of people who originally joined the Athenaeum, founded the Athenaeum and their backgrounds. So I grew up as a child of a single parent family in the back streets of Nottingham. My father had abandoned us soon after my birth. I went to state school, I was free school meals, I was all those sorts of things which, if you want to feel sorry for yourself, there's a long list there. I had a blast as a child. I mean, I had a good state education. I was lucky enough to get to a great university. I would argue the greater of the two. It's a great university. And I've gone on to do all the other things that I do, demonstrating my point about our country. Now, there are lots of people who want to argue that against me, either because they've got a personal story, which is the opposite, or because it's in their personal interest to be negative about things because they think they might profit from it. And I give them short shrift.
Yeah. We've touched on an interesting point there about education, which we haven't really talked about actually. And I'm again like you. I'm a sort of state school boy, and I think education is incredibly important. Do you, from your perspective as Lord Mayor, Lord Lieutenant of London,
failed Lord Mayor,
Lord Lieutenant of London, I apologise. What can you see some ways in which all of these institutions we talk about can interact with the education sector?
Yes, so I feel very strongly about this. In fact, there's a project that I'm hoping to get successfully implemented at Business London, you were kind enough to mention earlier. One of the problems that we have identified in Business London, and I'm sure it's a universal problem in the UK, but certainly Business London, is young people, children, have limited understanding of what their opportunities are from a work perspective. And so they arrive at late secondary school with limited to zero aspiration in terms of employment. And so what I'm hoping we're going to do, it's so far it's in the prototype stage, in fact it's not even prototype stage, it's the stage before that, embryonic stage, is that we will arm young people working in jobs in London with the material and the opportunity to go into schools and talk to children, junior schools and secondary school children, about their experiences in work, and then we'll give them the material to be able to explain the broader aspect. That takes the pressure off teachers to try to do that. It gives an opportunity for young people to demonstrate their community commitment, and it gives children an opportunity to ask questions and be influenced. And I bet everybody on this call will remember a moment or moments at school where suddenly The light
the
bulb.
light
That's
bulb
right.
moments. The light bulb moments.
Kenneth,
Yeah.
all the same, was one of those moments for me.
Yes,
But
yeah.
it's so important. So I think we've got more to do, and it's not right to say the government needs to do it. We, the people, we, the businesses, need to do that. And if we go back to the foundations of the Athenaeum, it wasn't people saying until the government decides they're going to do the following things, we aren't going to go anywhere. Business people and engineers just got on with it. And I think we need to be more confident to just get on with things, rather than having to go through that.
I think that's one of the interesting things about this sort of post-Napoleonic War period, that if you look back at the number of still important British institutions which were established in the immediate aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars in the 1820s, 1830s, there are a huge number of them. Yes, of course, some have been, the Royal Society, the Royal Institution, and the RSA had been founded in the previous century. But there was a huge dynamic growth in the early 19th century, which wasn't reliant on government. It had an impact on government, it had an impact on the way the country was run, but it wasn't of itself a government initiative. And I think that's sort of what you've said really kind of reinforces the importance of that, actually, and the importance of these independent institutions.
Yes. Well, I just said, in Business London, they're all bored of hearing me saying this now, but they probably aren't listening to this broadcast. I said
they can always listen to the recording.
Yes, I may have to remind them. But I said at one day, I said, look, spending our time trying to persuade the government to do lots and lots of things, it's frustrating. It's an industry, but it's frustrating. We should just get on with it. I said, I'm reminded of a cartoon from my days as an IBM salesman, which is two vultures on a tree branch. And one vulture says to the other one, I'm sick and tired of waiting for something to die. Let's go and kill something. And I think what we need to think about as the people, and particularly as businesses, is what can we do to make things better rather than moaning about what other people aren't doing. And back to the Athenaeum and similar institutions, it was people sitting around challenging each other on how to solve the problems of the day. And we've talked about sewage a lot, but it's a pretty big one, and it's current again today. And solved by people not saying the government should do something.
So thank you for that. We've got a question here about the question says, the London coffee shops were remarkably democratic institutions where anyone could come in off the street and for the price of coffee debate the issues of the day. And without going through the whole question, I think what the questioner is arguing is that the creation of these clubs kind of turn that from the price of a cup of coffee to something more expensive and more closed in some way. I think that when that's worth discussing. I think my own view on that would be there is with a free media, there is plenty of outlet for people, and the clubs are an additional way of expressing oneself. Clearly today there's the internet as well. So I think the question is an interesting one. Do you have a perspective on that?
Yes, we've also spoken about education. And I think education has a huge role to play. I gave a presentation at the Birkbeck College the other day, and what a remarkable place that is. All the audience, it was in the evening, obviously, because they're all at work in the day. All the audience has come in to listen to me talk, so that's already quite remarkable. But more importantly, they came in normally to study a subject which they thought was of relevance and importance to them, to make them more knowledgeable, more capable, more able, and so on. And so education has a large role to play in sharing these things. It shouldn't be the privilege of the man who works at the Crick Institute to only know about these things, that the professor at the Cambridge Laboratory to know about these things. And the great thing about the modern media is these are generally available. I don't obviously know who our audience is today, but a lot of things that frustrate me that I don't understand properly, I find an answer online in a YouTube video or something. It's a pathetic point coming here. But the other day I got really cross that someone had discussed at something I was at, the binomial theorem, which I knew when I was 14. I couldn't remember what it was, and it really, really bugged me. 40 minutes later, I found two videos. I'm an expert on it. I could talk about Pascal's triangle and everything. It all comes flooding back. So, and in the 18th and 19th century, that was hard to do as an individual. You had to go to the library if you were lucky. There was one. So now it's available. So there are no excuses for not knowing, and I think not for not participating.
Yes, thank you. So we've got a questions come in here. Our ancestors were bold and promoted their discoveries. We need to do this again and show that we can take the initiative. I guess does that mean our generation or Britain? I don't know, but take it either way. AI has a lot of potential and is still developing. What ideas do you suggest how to reach the UK public first and then the world? Interesting one.
So AI, I've been in IT, as you've gathered from
Yes.
the introduction, for about half a century, rather depressingly. I'm sure that first program I wrote is now working somewhere. But anyway, half a century. And so I've seen these waves of actually massive transformation. The internet was the last one. The next one is definitely going to be AI. For two reasons. One is people have invented very clever ways to do something which we've been talking about for a long time, like fractal, et cetera, et cetera. But now we've got the compute power to make them happen. And secondly, there is huge commercial competition to do something with it. So that will spring this to the next step. I can't predict, as I couldn't predict what the internet was going to be. I can't predict what the impact of AI will be, other than to be pretty confident after 50 years of this, it will be positive and not negative, because we, the humans, will direct it in the right kind of way. What we've got to be careful, though, is it isn't kept by a small number of people making an enormous amount of money from it. And I'm reminded of that great, actually it wasn't great, but a very important American union leader who had one of those great lines that I've lived on for many, many years. He said, if hard work was such a good thing, the rich would have kept it for themselves. And what we need to be careful is that AI doesn't take away, as it were, the hard work of the poor, so they're not earning and they're not feeling self-respect, but actually it augments the life of everybody. But I'm confident that it has the capability to do that. I'm pretty confident that we'll pull that off. The UK has every reason to be in the vanguard of AI deployment. We won't be the leaders. The Chinese are well ahead of the West, so we're hard to catch up. But America and the UK have got some geniuses, and I'm lucky enough one is a client of mine, geniuses who've invented brilliant ways of accelerating the power of AI and so on. So we're just at the birth of the dawn, really, of that development. I think this will depend on the government making sure the regulation is right to protect the downside. But I don't think we can stop the commercial upside. And I just hope people in the UK seize that opportunity and don't let it all be exported.
So if things go well, then effectively the benefits this could be shared widely in society. Yes. And although clearly some jobs may be lost because of increased use of AI, they will result in more jobs being created, which potentially attract higher salaries. And the way to ensure people have access to that is through good education.
Spot on. And back in the 70s, when I worked for IBM, there was an enormous pressure against computers all over the place because it was putting people out of work, and it was obviously changing work. And IBM liked to keep a low profile, but it got so dangerous they had to do something. And they ran, I suppose but I wasn't involved with the running of it, ran a fantastic one-page ad in the big newspapers, in the broadsheets. And it was the following. It was text, and it said, two men were watching work on a building site. And one man turned to the other and said, if they weren't using that digger machine, they could employ 20 men with spades. And then the next bit of text said, man replied, if they didn't employ 20 men with spades, they could employ 100 with teaspoons. IBM. And actually, that technological progression, which makes life safer and better for all, is something we shouldn't stand in the way of.
Yes. That's very interesting. Right, we have now got round to 1443, which I'm told is the time we probably need to draw. So I apologise to those of you who have not had your questions answered. Been some really good, excellent questions. We tried to take as many as we possibly can. Sadly, we can't do all of them, but I'm very grateful to Ken for spending so much time on this. So I think we've had a really interesting journey here. We've talked a bit about the Athenaeum Club, but we've broadened it out, hopefully, and we've showed how it's maybe relevant to development in today's one. I think perhaps that's one of the themes, if you like, of the Knowledge Mile series. You know, it's not just about the past, it's actually about the future as well. I think it's important. I really want to thank you, Sir Kenneth, for speaking on this today. Up on screen right now, we have got the next lectures in this series. On Monday, the 15th of April, we have Leadership in Sustainable Finance, charting a course through purpose, profit and politics. And I think that actually comes back a bit to what you were talking about earlier on, so that's an interesting one. On Thursday, the 18th of April, and here's something quite different, a modern interpretation of the art of fan making and its realistic contribution to climate change and the energy transition. Well, for something really different, that's a good one to go for. And then Monday, the 22nd of April, Governance to Prosper, the importance of integrity, values and policy. My goodness me, that's been completely central to everything you and I have been discussing. So I think it's been great. Thank you to all our audience for listening and watching today. Thank you again to Sir Kenneth for all your time and wisdom, accumulated sort of knowledge and experience over a lifetime. Finally, in terms of the rubric, all of these lectures are recorded. They're posted on the YouTube channel in case you'd like to revisit anything. And we hope to see you all again soon for another lecture in the Knowledge Mile series. Thank you and goodbye.